Hello, welcome back to A Drunk History of Middle-earth. It is me, Chris. How are we doing? How's it going? We're going to continue our very long series on Sauron today, and I think we're up to part 7. Now, bit of a heads up for this one. Quite by accident, but immediately obvious with hindsight. We're going to cover the fall of Númenor today. Very, very big event in Tolkien's world. And it's weird. So at some point, I do plan to cover Númenor in total as a civilization because it's just crazy. It's very much tied up with the Second Age. I have enjoyed how much Second Age knowledge we've been able to drop while doing this. So hopefully you've enjoyed it as well. But how are you doing? I hope you're well. The last episode seemed a really long time ago, but it seemed like a lot of people enjoyed it. I had a lot of positive messages, it's always nice to have some feedback. Seems like everybody enjoyed just as much as I did, doing a blow by blow pretty much on a fictional war. So that's very, very, very good to know. Right, bit of housekeeping. What's been going on? Becca is not joining us today. She's going to sit out the Sauron series and going to rejoin us when we do some watch along, some Hobbit stuff, and some of the palate cleansing stuff I've got planned for when this series ends. But there's one more episode, I'm fairly confident, of Sauron in the Second Age before we move on to Sauron in the Third Age. So, fuck me, I actually think we might get maybe a 10-episode series out of Sauron, which is just crazy, just thinking about how much has been said about this guy. But given that he is the titular Lord of the Rings, it makes a certain amount of sense. How is everyone doing? I hope we're good. I hope we are really, really good. Yeah, I'm just looking back through. So we did Sauron's names and titles, his powers, the alternate versions of him, first age, beginning of the second, middle of the second. Now we're doing Sauron still in the middle of the Second Age in the fall of Númenor. And then we're going to move to the War of the Last Alliance next, which takes us into the Third Age, which is crazy. It's crazy. I'm doing good. I had a horrendous hangover the other day, so I don't know how I'm going to take this forward, but the drunk part of A Drunk History of Middle-earth, I was the drunk part the other night, and it was horrible. Hangovers in your 30s are no fun whatsoever. Goodness me. Becca's been to New York. It's been really, really nice. Her and her mum went. They had a really, really good time, and in just over 2 weeks, her and her dad are going to Egypt. So that should be a lovely trip for everyone involved. I'm writing a book at the moment. It's fiction. It's got nothing to do with anything to do with like Tolkien. It's more like horror. It's a supernatural horror, and it's set at a place called Beamish near us. And my holiday is I just want to go and stay at the hall because I've committed to this book now. 30,000 words in, and it's set in a small Durham village where there is a bit of a sneaky cult going on. Yes, I said that right. Sneaky cult. So yeah, I've always been a big fan of Stephen King and Clive Barker, Dean Koontz, people like that. So I always wanted to try my hand at my own horror story, and we're there. So big thank you. It's got nothing to do with the podcast, so don't worry about it. I'm just giving you an update on my life. Big thank you to people who've read it and fed back so far. It's been very, very useful, and I need, the brutality of it is exactly what I need. Yeah, so that's really just a snapshot of what's going on in our life. It is now Sunday afternoon. I'm just going to release this as soon as I'm done, because tonight me and Becca are having a date night, and I don't know if anyone else is like this who's in a relationship listening to this. We've had such a stressful day so far with the dog and the child that I didn't even want to do date night anymore. Like, there was a certain point where me and Becca have been fine, like, with each other all day, but we were so stressed out about the kid and the dog, like, just being dickheads, that I looked at her, and in my head I was just like, I don't even want to fucking do date night. Fuck this. I want to cancel the reservation. You're just like, you made our daughter. I made our daughter. This is half your fault. This is bullshit. I don't want to do a date night with you. Which is probably all the more reason to do the date night, thinking on it. We're going to a lovely fancy Italian restaurant called Babuccio in Newcastle. Apparently it's very, very swanky. Well, it is swanky. I went the other night. I was drinking lots of wine, but that will not be repeated tonight. But apparently very good food. So let's not dilly-dally. Let's get on with the show. So, if you're joining now, I understand more for this episode and last episode if you were to just jump in, because we are talking about very specific occurrences. So last episode was the War of Elves and Sauron, and this is the Fall of Númenor, the downfall of Númenor, or the Akalabeth, depending what we call it. So I can understand that you jump into the middle of the series about this. I will try and go over, if I refer to something that's in a previous episode, I'll try and give a brief explanation, but point you back to that episode. Likewise, I do just want to... I'm very well aware of the conceit of the show that I explain things as if we're sat in a pub together. And I want to keep that going. So I don't want anyone to think they have to have previous knowledge. So I'm going to refer to a few things off the top of my head. I'll just get them out of the way now. If I say the word Arda, it means the world. It is Earth. If I say the word Aman, it is a continent to the west of Middle-earth where the gods live, and gods with a small g. If I say the word Valar, it is these lower g gods or archangels or mighty spirits who created the world under the direction of the big G god, who is Eru Ilúvatar, and that is a fictional name for the Christian god. So I realise that I always tell people to jump into this podcast where you find a topic interesting, and I will say, if you want to know more, go listen to an episode I've already done about it, but I don't want you to feel like you've got to get your books out just to listen to an episode, because there's this book that released recently called Onyx Storm or something. I've never read the series, I've no idea what it's about, but for some reason it cropped up. I think it's because I watch a lot of stuff to do with books recently, just seeing how people market novels and shit, because it's just bizarre. Like, some of the worst authors I've seen really successful marketers. So you're like, oh shit, okay. And there's this book called Onyx Storm where there's that meme that people who are fans of the series have to spend hours and hours researching just to fucking understand what's going on in this book. And I don't want that. I don't want that to happen. So if I refer to something which I might miss it, the stuff that I might just take as common knowledge because we're so deep into it, but I'll try and give you a couple of primers. So there's people like Manwë, who is the chief of the Valar, Vardar, who is his wife. And so if you ever want to look about some of the earlier podcast episodes about especially the creation of the universe, I talk about some of this bigger cosmic stuff, but I'll try and limit it. So, when we left off last episode, Sauron had just had his arse handed to him by Gil-galad and the Númenóreans, who saved them with a giant navy. Sauron returned to Mordor, and he was furious. He was bitter. He was absolutely raging that the Númenóreans had bested him. So he focused in. He locked in, as the kids would say. He bided his time and started building his forces again. He now knew, because of all the stuff that happened with the Rings of Power, that dominating the elves was kind of out of the question. So he focuses on distributing the other Rings of Power. Of the 9 rings, the 9 rings for men, he distributes them. So, like there's 1 ring to rule them all, 3 rings for the elves, 7 for the dwarf lords, 9 for mortal men. So we're talking about the 9 for mortal men. Of this 9, 3 of them go to corrupted Númenórean lords. 1 goes to an eastern king called Camul, and 5 are given to unknown humans, and we don't know who they are. If you've played the Shadow of War and Shadow of Mordor games, Talion becomes one of these Nazgul eventually, I think. But again, that's just a game. It's not the same. The rest of the dwarf rings are also distributed, because you remember the elves possibly gave one to Durin the Third, possibly the third, as a gift. If it wasn't the third, it was the fourth. Anyway, they gave a ring to Durin, but the other dwarven rings are distributed as well. And as we've mentioned before, Sauron considers these a failure because they don't have the same effect on dwarves that they do on humans. Sauron wants to dominate you, not in a sexy way, maybe in a sexy way, but he wants to dominate you. He wants you to be a slave to his will. That does sound sexy. He wants you to be a slave to his will. And dwarves are too brat for that. They're brats. They don't obey. Dwarves will snap but never bend. Humans will bend bend them up like a fucking pretzel. God, I'm sounding horny today. Jesus. It's just anytime you say the word domination, like Tolkien would spin in his grave. We could use Tolkien to generate electricity if he understood just how many times the word dominate appears in a way that he never intended. Now, anyway, in terms of Sauron, the rings are distributed, but he goes quiet for a bit. He's building his forces, and he's primarily expanding eastwards and southwards. And to quote Tolkien, and here we go with the domination, but with Sauron, to quote Tolkien, he has acquired dominion over many savage tribes in the east, of old corrupted by Morgoth, and urged them to seek land and booty in the west. Now, I remember when I moved to Durham and I sought booty, and I found Rebecca. So I can imagine it's something very similar here. And it was a time of uneasy peace. So the war between the elves and Sauron ended in about the year 1700, 1701. And it really doesn't, nothing really noteworthy happens, apart from what I've mentioned, until around the year 800, 1800 onwards. So, you know, Middle-earth was kind of left alone as a little bit of a breather with an uneasy peace. And Sauron, because he just leaves it alone because he's wholly concerned with conquests in the east. And around this time, Celeborn uses this as an opportunity to rejoin Galadriel in Lindon. So, you know, Celeborn goes to be back with his wife. It's just the scale of elf marriages is crazy. Like 100 years later, it's like, oh shit, yeah, I should go and see my wife. But yeah, anyway, so from the year 1800 onwards, Sauron's a little bit quiet. And then this kind of, so that's 1800, right? And then we really don't pick back up with anything involving Sauron until the year 2251, so nearly 500 years later. Or 451 years later, if you're going to be a dick about it. And this is when the Nazgul first appear. So he spends all that time corrupting humans to his... But this is something that kind of blew my mind a little bit. Like, just rediscovering a bit of knowledge that you'd forgot about. It's like, you think about it, it's like, holy shit, yeah, the Nazgul, like, 4,000, 5,000 years old. Like, oh my god. And they are slaves to the rings. And we can also assume that this time the Dwarvish Rings of Power were also being handed down to their descendants. And to quote about the Silmarillion, from the Silmarillion, about the Nazgul and their corruption, unseen by all eyes in the world beneath the sun, and they could see things in the worlds invisible to mortal men. But too often they beheld only the phantoms and delusions of Sauron. And one by one, sooner or later, according to their native strength and to the good or evil of their wills in the beginning, they fell under the thraldom of the ring that they bore, and under the domination of the one, which was Sauron's. And they became forever invisible, save to him that wore the ruling ring, and they entered into the realm of the shadows. The Nazgul were they, the ring-wraiths, the enemy's most terrible servants. Darkness went with them, and they cried with the voices of death. And it's crazy that, if you caught that there, that some of these men were good. These were good men in the beginning, and it didn't matter, because good or evil, it didn't matter. That was erased, and they were bound to Sauron's will, they became inconsequential. And it's like Bilbo says, we see what happens with the life given to a mortal by the rings, is that you start to feel stretched. It's not like you go forward in time, it's just that your preserved matter at the time you take the ring is stretched forever and ever and ever until there's barely anything left of you. But during this time, the Dwarvish rings were distributed, like I said, and they're not successful, and I've got a snippet here about that. The dwarves indeed proved tough and hard to tame. They ill endure the domination of others, and the thoughts of their hearts are hard to fathom. Nor can they be turned to shadows. They use their rings only for the getting of wealth, but wrath and an overmastering greed of gold were kindled in their hearts, of which evil enough after came to the prophet of Sauron. It is said that the foundation of each of the 7 hoards of the dwarf kings of old was a golden ring. But all these hoards long ago were plundered, and the dragons devoured them. And of the 7 rings, some were consumed in fire, and some Sauron recovered. So I think, oh god, the last count is was it Sauron recovered 4 and the dragons consumed 3? I think might be it. Or it might be the other way around, is that dragons consume 3, Sauron 4, blah, blah, blah. But that's what's happening in Middle-earth, the mainland. This is where now, so I may have used this before when I've talked in the podcast, Middle-earth and the history and Tolkien's characters and stories, it's a tapestry. It weaves in and out. So now we're going to weave our little wiggly worm across the sea to Númenor, where things are getting pretty fucked up. And just as a reminder, Númenor was the island that was given to humans who helped the elves in the war that ended the First Age. It was given to the Edain, the 3 tribes of humans who moved into Beleriand and helped the elves fight against Morgoth, sorry. And it's now at like 2,000, at least 2,000 years into the Second Age when this is happening. And the island, they've had kings that have ruled, and they started off really well. Elrond's brother was the first king of Númenor, and they started well. But things started to go downhill. This is why Númenor is known as the second fall of man. And the first fall of man was when humans awoke at the beginning of the First Age, and God stopped talking to them and Morgoth corrupted them. And again, I've got an episode on the origin of humans, so, go see that. So, in Númenor, things are fucked up. It is far 2,000 years or so into their their ruling of Númenor. They started off good, and it's a bit of a slide down. But they're descending now into pride and corruption. And this is before Sauron gets there. So he just speeds things up. Sauron is the final event to them being twats. But he's not the cause of it. And to put it in Tolkien's own words, he says that Númenor has 3 stages to their civilization. The first stage is them being men of peace, and their courage is devoted to sea voyages, the good days. The second stage is called the days of pride and glory and the grudging of the ban. Now, the ban for the Númenorians, just to let you know, when the island was raised, the Númenorians were given long life, longer than most other humans, but they were told, we can't make you immortal. The reason for this is God, Eru, gave humans 2 gifts. His 2 gifts to humans were, one, that eventually they would die and they would be able to move beyond the world completely to rejoin him in the timeless halls. Nobody else gets that. Everybody else is there until the end of time, which can become a horrible, horrible thing. And second gift that they got from God himself was free will, essentially. But, so, when the Valar raised Númenor out of the ocean, they said, we can't make you immortal because we can't take away the gift that Eru has already given you. We can give you another gift, which is longer life than most humans. So Elrond's brother lived to be about 500 years old or so, and that's why Aragorn lived so long as well. But there was a condition to this. So they got the island and they got longer life, but there was a condition. The condition was, don't sail west. Don't sail towards our lands. And that's because if a human goes to where the Valar live, to where the spirits live, they will die quicker. So do you know at the end of like Lord of the Rings where Bilbo and Frodo and eventually Sam and Gimli, they all go west. They all go to live on an island called Tol Eressëa. And it's beautiful, but it's described as a moth being in too bright of a light, and you will wither and die. And the Valar knew that nothing good would come of this, that the envy of being around immortal people when you're not immortal yourself would just be worse off. So they said, it's called the Ban of the Valar. Don't sail out of sight of Númenor on the western shores. So for thousands of years, that was fine. The Númenorians, they sailed north, south and east, and they explored the entire world. It wasn't round in those days. The world was flat. And they were able to even get a glimpse of the gates that would take them outside of the world in some, in some interpretations of it. And it was good. Things were good for a while. But now the second stage comes, which is the grudge of the ban. So the continent of a man where they shouldn't go. Elves would then, but it wasn't the other way. Elves would come and visit them all the time. And the Númenóreans were friends with elves for a long time, but then they started to divide into camps between those who were friends with the elves and those who stopped trusting them. And you'll see that this goes on, this jealousy. And Númenóreans, eventually, they wanted to live forever, not just a really, really long time. And these beliefs, they get more serious. So as the second stage goes on, the Númenóreans become more corrupted and powerful. Their lifespans start to shorten because of this. And the second stage ends when a certain king of Númenor takes the throne. And he was called Tar-Calion, but you would probably know him as Ar-Pharazôn, if you had heard of him at all. And just remember, I do plan to cover Númenor at some point, so I do have to simplify these events because I'm trying to keep it where Sauron's involved. But in the earliest drafts of Tolkien, because remember he reworked stuff a lot, he always reworked stuff right until the day he died. In the earliest drafts, Ar-Pharazôn was the 13th king of Númenor. But in later versions of the history, he was either the 24th or the 25th king, depending on your source. But either way, he's from a very long line of kings. I'm just going to take a drink of coffee. Ar-Pharazôn was the pinnacle of Númenorian hubris and corruption, and proof that they had well and truly fallen under the shadow of Morgoth. And remember, the shadow of Morgoth is Morgoth, who is essentially the devil. He's put all his power into the world and literally tainted like the atoms of the world, so that he tainted everything he touched. It was like original sin, kind of. But Ar-Pharazôn was not a good time. And he ascends the throne by force in the year 3255 of the Second Age. So now we're moving on at a really steady clip, right? So Sauron is across the sea, laying dominion to Middle-earth. He's expanding aggressively. He's building his forces. He's got his empires. He's really building shit up. Across the sea in Númenor, Ar-Pharazôn. So it's about 1,004 years since the last time we heard anything, right? And I had a really funny thought when I was reading this and doing the dates and stuff, is that between the last thing we hear from Sauron with the Ringwraiths, the Nazgûl come in, they're like appearing, and then Ar-Pharazôn ascending the throne and becoming aware of Sauron and all the shit he's doing. Like, could I imagine Sauron just in church, like recounting his sins to Manwë? Like, and it just made me laugh, like a Catholic church. It's like, Father, it's been 1,004 years since my last confession. I gained dominion over pretty much the whole world. Feel like I'm ready to crack on with the Númenóreans now. And then Manwë just been like, okay, my son, say 12 Hail Vardas and we're sorted. And I would love to see fan art of that. But anyway, Ar-Pharazôn was a twat. He took his first cousin as a wife by force. Maybe rape? I don't know. Probably rape. That sounds very rapey to me. He also changed her name from Miriel, which is a really good elvish name, to Zimrafel, which is just shit. So yeah, he took his cousin. But the worst part of this, right, is the previous king to Ar-Pharazôn was called Tar-Palantir, and Palantir means far-seeing. And he had wanted to mend things with the Valar. Like, Tar-Palantir saw the course that Númenor was on, that how badly they'd fallen, and he wanted to try and steer them back on track. And this was where there was kind of like a bit of a civil war, because there was the people who agreed with the king, and the people who... No, sorry, there was the people who wanted to be friends with the elves, and there was people who thought, fuck the elves. And Tar-Palantir eventually died in grief because he wasn't able to correct the course of history. He wasn't able to get his people back on track. But what really annoys me about this is that during Tar-Palantir's reign, it said that the Valar were still angry about the actions of the kings and people who came before him, which is just fucking bullshit to me. Like, the Valar, obviously, like, unless you're the elves, the fucking golden children, the Valar get to be like Greek gods, like really fucking petty and small-minded. Shout out to Mia, who pointed this out, that the Valar do at times seem like the Greek god pantheon. Like, they, playing favourites and being dickhead. Like, it's just any idea that, like, that idea that the sins of the father are revisited on the son. It's just like, what the fuck? I had nothing to do with that. Get the fuck out of here. Fucking blame me for something that happened in the past. Fuck off. It's like when people blame, like there's a distinction to be made between, like, what your country has done, but then when people expect you to take personal accountability of that, you're like, fuck off. Can you imagine, like, walking up to a German person now and telling them, like, oh, you should be sorry about Hitler? Well, first of all, he was Austrian, Chris, so duh. Or, like, when if someone comes to me and is like, oh, you should return the stuff from the British Museum, I'd be like, what the fuck do you want me to do about it? Fuck off. Fuck out of here with your guilt. Anyway, but yeah, that really pissed me off. Is that I was like, he's trying to do something good here, and the Valar are still annoyed? Fuck off. Assholes. Anyway, I've obviously got issues with authority figures. But the last stage of Númenor begins with Ar-Pharazôn, right? Remember I said there was three stages? The last stage is, I don't know what, probably just called the Akalabeth, the downfall. Ar-Pharazôn is incredibly prideful and ambitious, and he wants everything in the world. And we'll come back to him. We'll leave him there. We've now got our stage set in Númenor. We're going to go back to Sauron, because in Middle-earth, he seems to have forgotten his defeat at the hands of the elves, and he's been very, very busy over the past 1,000 or so years. So, I'll read to you, and to compass, if he might, the downfall of Númenor. He brooked no freedom nor any rivalry, and he named himself Lord of the Earth. A mask he could wear that if he wished might deceive the eyes of men, seeming to them wise and fair. But he ruled rather by force and fear, if they might avail, and those who perceived his shadow spreading over the world called him the Dark Lord, and named him the Enemy. And he gathered again under his government all the evil things of the days of Morgoth that remained on earth, or beneath it, and the orcs were at his command and multiplied like flies. Thus the black years began, which the elves called the days of flight. In that time many of the elves of Middle-earth fled to Lindon, and thence over the seas never to return. And many were destroyed by Sauron and his servants. But in Lindon Gil-galad still maintained his power, and Sauron dared not yet to pass the mountains of Ered Luin, nor to assail the havens, and Gil-galad was aided by the Númenorians. Elsewhere Sauron reigned, and those who would be free took refuge in the fastness of wood and mountain, and ever fear pursued them. In the east and south well nigh all men were under his dominion, and they grew strong in those days, and built many towns and walls of stone. And they were numerous and fierce in war, and armed with iron. To them Sauron was both king and god, and they feared him exceedingly, for he surrounded his abode with fire. And during all of this time, Sauron starts to take names to himself. Names that he thinks reflect his station, and his status as the mighty leader of the world. And he starts to call himself things like the King of Kings, the Lord of the World, the King of Men, and Lord of the Earth. So very, very humble. So, a quick quiz. Get your buzzers ready. You've got two incredibly powerful beings, nations, within the same relative part of the world. They both are incredibly ambitious. They are both incredibly prideful. And they are both incredibly powerful. And they both start to call themselves things that make it sound like they're going to take over the entire world. Can you imagine what happens when one of them hears about the other? Would they A, high five and say bro, and do that arm clasp like Arnie and Carl Weathers in Predator? Is that Carl Weathers? The guy who played Apollo Creed? Or would they B, ignore each other, because I'm sure that's not going to be a problem? Or would they C, want to absolutely fucking trash each other? Because it's going to be C. Ar-Pharazôn hears about this, right? He gets reports. And he also gets reports that Sauron has been attacking some Númenorian settlements as well. Ar-Pharazôn is apoplectic with rage. How fucking dare he? The audacity of this bitch. Ar-Pharazôn is like, how dare he? I am the king of men. I am the king of kings. I am the lord of the world. And I am the lord of the earth, blah, 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 blah. So he resolves to put down Sauron, who he calls the Pretender. Just who the fuck does he think he is compared to a Númenorian king? This is absolutely British Empire vibes. I'm just going to put this out there. This is just, yeah, crazy. It said that Sauron was attacking the settlements because he wanted to drive them back to the sea. Though I can't find specific sources on that. So if you can tell me where you can see that, please do tell me. I couldn't see anything that told us that he was specifically attacking the settlements. But something does spur Ar-Pharazôn into action, because he spends 5 years building a vast armament of ships and soldiers. So they arrive at the haven of Umbar, which is a coastal settlement south of Gondor. And this is in the year 3261 of the Second Age. And Ar-Pharazôn and his army march to Mordor. It takes them 7 days. And the coming sight of this Númenorian army, and it was a big army, was so big and so terrifying that the lands themselves looked empty, because all of Sauron's servants just flee. They deserted him. They would not stand before the Númenorians. And so, by the time Ar-Pharazôn gets near to Mordor, he sets up camp on a hill, and he commands Sauron to come forth. And he does. He does. Sauron realises that he's never going to beat them in a straight fight. He knows this. He looks at this army. He thinks, I don't know. Do you know what, right? I wouldn't even put it past him for him to not think about the last time they beat him, but instead just look at the army as it was now. And he realises they're too strong. He can't beat them in an open war. And plus, most of these people have fucked off anyway. So instead, he takes on his fair form. He takes on what I call twink form and the long flowy hair and shit. And he humbles himself before Ar-Pharazôn. He goes to him. He says, "Yep, take me, daddy. Take me, see, daddy." Ar-Pharazôn strips Sauron of all of his titles. You're not the lord of anything, motherfucker. And he takes Sauron as a hostage with him to Númenor. Which is a really bad move, because he fucked up, right? This is where he done goofed. Because he's played into Sauron's hands. Sauron knew this was going to happen, and this is where he thought, right, can't take him in a fight, gonna take him from behind, sneakily, spit on my hand, see how it goes. So he knows he can get where he wants through cunning, so I'll read again a quote. "And Sauron came, and it was messy and all over his belly." No, I'm joking, I'll start again. "And Sauron came, even from his mighty tower of Barad-dûr he came, and made no offer of battle, for he perceived that the power and majesty of the kings of the sea surpassed all rumour of them, so that he could not trust even the greatest of his servants to withstand them. And he saw not his time yet to work his will with the Dúnedain. And he was crafty, well skilled to gain what he would by subtlety when force might not avail. Therefore he humbled himself before Ar-Pharazôn, and smoothed his tongue, and men wondered, for all that he said seemed fair and wise. But Ar-Pharazôn was not yet deceived, and it came into his mind that, for the better keeping of Sauron, and of his oaths of fealty, he should be brought to Númenor, there to dwell as a hostage for himself and all his servants in Middle-earth. To this Sauron assented as one constrained, yet in his secret thought he received it gladly, for it chimed indeed with his desire. And Sauron passed over the sea and looked upon the land of Númenor, and on the city of Ar-Menellos in the days of its glory, and he was astounded. But his heart was filled with more, with envy and hate." So this is the start of Sauron's beach holiday in the Isle of Númenor. It's a lot like Greece, and everyone wore Speedos. But over the next 50 years, he would be the most important voice in Ar-Pharazôn's ear. In fact, he starts straight away, and within 3 years, he's made the king's chief advisor. 3 years from prisoner to advisor. Crazy. But other lords of Númenor, powerful people in Númenor, see this and they begin to kiss his ass, seeing how much influence he has. And he corrupts and poisons the king's mind more than it was, stroking his ego and inflaming him now against the Valar. Sauron sees a golden opportunity to fuck up Númenor completely, and he takes it. But I want you to hold one thing in your mind as we're going through this. Sauron is only really doing all of this to this degree because the Númenorians humiliated him. Like, do you remember a couple of episodes ago where I mentioned he was probably okay with letting Númenor survive as long as he could conquer them? And I think I actually quoted it earlier in this episode as well. This is all now in motion because it wasn't enough to just conquer them now. Like, he wants to destroy them because he was humiliated during the War of the Elves and Sauron, and during having to humble himself before Ar-Pharazôn. Like, this is about as personal as it gets with Sauron, and this is vindictive shit. And I'll remind you at the end, again, just to keep this in scope, but I'll give you this quote from the book Morgoth's Ring. But though Sauron's whole true motive was the destruction of the Númenóreans, this was a particular matter of revenge upon Ar-Pharazôn for humiliation. Sauron, unlike Morgoth, would have been content for the Númenóreans to exist as his own subjects, and indeed he used a great many of them that he corrupted to his allegiance. So if not for the hubris of Ar-Pharazôn, Sauron would have been content to just have them as his subjects. But no, he was humiliated, so the entire civilization needs to die. That is... The thing is, I'd say that's crazy, but looking at some of our world leaders now, it's not unbelievable. Like, our Prime Minister, I always get the sense he's a very fucking petty person. Trump is a very fucking petty person. In fact, right, I don't think it's... Well, I've just given a left and a right leader, but I don't think it's a matter of... I think to get into positions of power, on some level, you have to be quite a petty person to not, like, let the little things go. Maybe. Anyway, Sauron becomes the king's advisor and gains the loyalty of a lot of Númenóreans, and he becomes called the Zigur, which is Adunaic for wizard. And wizard in Tolkien, as we know, means a wise man. It's not like a sorcerer. It's mainly used that they are a wise person. And if you're wondering, I've talked about it before, but Adunaic is the language of Númenor, which becomes the father of the language of Westron. And the language of Westron is the language that the Lord of the Rings is written in. And Tolkien, as a fictional historian, he quote-unquote translates it from Westron into English. So at any point when you read in Lord of the Rings, it is written in Westron, and the characters are speaking Westron, and then it gets translated into English by Tolkien. It's just part of his whole shtick. So it's kind of like, it's a father tongue. It's the father of the common tongue of Middle-earth. Like Latin to the Romance languages, like Spanish, French, or like or English being derived from Germanic languages, etc., etc. So Sauron becomes the king's chief advisor after 3 years, and he uses this knowledge to help the king get anything he wants. And he flatters him. And it all works. It does. And it always makes me think that Sauron's like a fixer. And, there's that old Frankie Boyle joke where he does the impression of a fixer when like you're visiting a head of state, and he's like, "You want a girl? You want them young? I can get you. Oh, you want a boy? You want a boy girl? I can get you this spider child." And it's, yeah, I imagine Sauron's like that. Sauron now, throughout all this time, for 50 years or so, he plants the idea in their heads that Númenóreans aren't allowed to go west because the Valar are scared, and the Valar are petty, and the Valar are jealous. And, I mean, to be fair, I don't think he's wrong, but he says the Valar fear you. That's why they don't want you going near their lands. And he starts to plant these false ideas that if Ar-Pharazôn was to invade Valinor and Aman and the Valar, that he could take the everlasting life for himself and become immortal. Now this is appealing, and we're going to take a slight tangent here. This is appealing because part of the corruption of humans by Morgoth, i.e. the devil, way back in the day, back in the First Age, part of their corruption is that Morgoth made humans fear death. It turned it from a gift into something to be feared. And instead of it being you have your experiences in this world, and then you get to go and live forever with Eru Ilúvatar in the Timeless Halls and see everyone you've ever loved, it's instead something to fear. The dark and the death it's now something that's scary. We've already mentioned that explicitly within Tolkien, death is a gift. The death and being able to pass beyond the circles of the world is a gift from God. And Morgoth corrupted that. So it's always been explicit that the elves, it's also been as well, like, the Númenóreans have got it the wrong way around. Like, yes, the elves and the Valar might be jealous on some level, but it's not because of their strength. It's because elves and the Valar, they are trapped here until the end of time. They are trapped until the world itself ends. And then, the elves in particular, they don't know what's going to happen to them. They know that humans get to leave the world forever, but elves don't. And they've got to wait, and for all they know, they might get to the very end of the universe, and Eru might say, good job, you're not needed anymore, and that just might be it. And they don't know that. And as well as that, right, I want you to think about this, that if you're an elf who can live forever, but you also don't forget anything, so you've got every bit of grief, every bit of sorrow that never fades. I do think humans are the lucky ones there, that an elf will carry their sorrows with them until the end of time. And Eru himself does say, like, right at the beginning, and again, just, you know, go back and listen to our early episodes about it, Eru says to them, to the Valar and the Maiar, when they're going to come into the universe for the first time, he says, once you're in there, you can't come back until the end of the universe, until everything ends. And by that time, it will be considered a punishment on some level. You will hate it because it will be so awful to have to deal with, because time will become a burden. So to put time on these timeless beings and then have no way to lift it until the very end of things is, yeah. So if you take Earth as our far distant history, we're only still in about the 7th age of the Earth. So if that, you know, Lord of the Rings happens in the 3rd age, this stuff we're talking about now is the 2nd age. We're still only in around the 7th age. So it's still no end in sight. So if there was, you know, that's why it's. Can you see why death would be a gift in that scenario? But this is what Sauron twists this, and instead says, no, immortality is fucking mint, and the Valar don't want you to have it. So one of the reasons Númenor declines and starts to fall, and they grudge the Valar and the ban, is that they think that they should have immortality along with the elves. That's why they become jealous of it. And at some point, before Ar-Pharazôn, they started to look west. In fact, it was the actual... So if Ar-Pharazôn was the 24th or 25th king, it was the 12th and the 13th kings, a son and a father and son, 13th and the 14th, whatever, it doesn't matter. Anyway, they had a conversation with the Valar by way of messengers. And they said, hey, why can't we go? And the Valar basically said, like, you're not the ones who should be jealous here. Like, we should be jealous. And it's that, like, I'm just trying to impress on you how diabolical the work Sauron's doing is. That he's not only of the Númenorians convinced themselves of their fear of death, but Sauron's stoking that, and eventually it all devolves into something apocalyptic. And that's it. The fall of Númenor is characterized by this obsession with death, and Sauron speeds it up. And I'll read a bit of just now of what the Númenorians used to be able to see from their shores. And I do think this is a little bit cruel, like leaving it just within sight. So, for in those days, Valinor remained in the world visible, and there Ilúvatar permitted the Valar to maintain upon the earth an abiding place, a memorial of that which might have been if Morgoth had not cast his shadow on the world. This the Númenorians knew full well, and at time when all the air was clear and the sun was in the east, they would look out and descry far off in the west a city white shining on a distant shore, and a great harbour and a tower. For in those days the Númenorians were far-sighted, yet even so it was only the keenest eyes among them that could see this vision, from the Meneltama maybe, which is the main mountain, or from some tall ship that lay off their western coast as far as it was lawful for them to go. For they did not dare break the ban of the lords of the west, but the wise among them knew that this distant land was not indeed the blessed realm of Valinor, but was Avalone, the haven of the Eldar upon Eressëa, easternmost of the Undying Lands. This annoys me a little bit, because that is now a glimpse of, hey, this is heaven on earth, but you'll never go there. Like, what the fuck? Like, if humans weren't meant to be there, why would you keep it within sight? Like, that's a bit of a dick move in my opinion, but hey-ho. Like I said, so I mentioned the conversation the 13th and the 14th kings had, or 12th and 13th, whatever. It was basically two kings, Tara Tanamir and his dad, Tar Kiryatan, the shipbuilder. They were proud men and they were eager for wealth. Like, they weren't evil per se at the time, but they started to question the Valar. And they asked, like, why can't we be immortal? Why can the elves be? And the Valar responded to their messengers with, when they talked about elves, they cannot escape and are bound to this world, never to leave it so long as it lasts, for its life is theirs. And you are punished for the rebellion of men, you say, in which you had small part, and so it is that you die. But that was not at first appointed for a punishment. Thus you escape and leave the world and are not bound to it, in hope or in weariness. Which of us, therefore, should envy the others? That's what I said just now, right? The elves. So humans seem to be under this impression that they die as a punishment, that Morgoth had lied way back in the prehistory of human, like when humans first awoke, and said, oh, by the way, you die because of a punishment, and if you worship me long enough and hard enough, you won't die. And that's what I mean by the corrupting of Eru's gift, that humans should die. It is natural, and it is a good thing, quote unquote. But having us believe otherwise, that's that great trick that he's done, the bastard. But the kings didn't like this answer, and I think it was Tara Tanamir. Yeah, it was Tara Tanamir. I think was the 13th king, and he didn't like that, and he was the first Númenorian king that he clung to life until the very end of his days, rather than choosing to die and pass on the scepter to his son. So you know how, like, Aragorn can choose when to die, Númenorians could choose when to die. To me, that's a very good gift as well. And the tradition used to be that they would pass the scepter on when their sons were ready to take over at, like, the prime of their life. But instead, this one is where his fear of death starts to cling on, and he goes way past when he should. And there's that bit from the appendix of Lord of the Rings where Aragorn says to Arwen, like, what, would you rather me just stay until I don't know what the fuck's going on and I fall out of my chair? Like, no, I'm gonna die when I'm still strong. Like, fuck yeah. And this is the reason I'm talking about this, is because this is a point in Númenor's history where they divide into two camps. And the Troubles are two groups. One group is called the King's Men, who distrust elves, distrust the Valar, and become enemies of them. The bad Númenorians, if we were to go that route. And the Faithful, who are still friends with elves and who still trust the Valar. And so all of this happens like a long time before Ar-Pharazôn comes to the throne. But this is where that faction becomes, because this leads to civil war on Númenor, essentially. Like, there's two groups of people. So when Sauron comes and starts to choose to have people suffer, naturally it's going to be the Faithful. So now there's a scapegoat of people on Númenor who can be tormented. And Ar-Pharazôn was a leader of the King's Men. He was very much of the fuck the Valar and fuck the elves kind of camp. So Sauron loved this. They spurned the relations, and by the time of Ar-Pharazôn, like, no elves came to the Númenor, unless in secret. I'm a little bit hazy on that. But the Faithful were persecuted, and they became human sacrifices. And this is the people like Isildur and Elendil and Aragorn, etc. They're all descended from the Faithful, so they're still elf friends. And the situation of this corruption is summed up by Tolkien in letter 131, where it goes over what Sauron did. And remember, this is just a really dense part of history, so there's a lot of weaving of stuff around the same time. So it talks about Sauron going to Númenor. It says, he swiftly rises by his cunning and knowledge from servant to chief counselor of the king, and seduces the king and most of the lords and people with these lies, right? And here we go, this is the bit. He denies the existence of God, saying that the One is a mere invention of the jealous Valar of the West and the oracle of their own wishes. The chief of the gods is he that dwells in the void, who will conquer in the end, and in the void makes endless realms for his servants. The ban is only a lying device of fear, to restrain the kings of men from seizing everlasting life and rivaling the Valar. A new religion and worship of the dark, with its temple under Sauron arises. The faithful are persecuted and sacrificed. The Númenóreans carry their evil will to Middle-earth, and there become cruel and wicked lords of necromancy, slaying and tormenting men, and the old legends are overlaid with dark tales of horror. So this is one of the things he's been working on over these 50 years, is he's preaching about Morgoth now, and he turns the Númenóreans to the worship of Morgoth. And he does again exactly what Morgoth did to the original humans. This is the second fall of humans. It's just beat for beat, exactly the same thing that worked on humans before, works on humans now, and eventually 3 ships leave Númenor, just like 3 tribes of humans left Hildorian to go to Beleriand. 3 ships leave Númenor and get to Middle-earth and form the fucking... Is it 3 ships? I don't know. Something about 3. But anyway, yeah. So it's just the same corruption story again. It's the same fall of humanity again. And Sauron now, he twists all he knows about gods and the Valar and Morgoth and flips them on his head. And you've got to remember, you might have a question at some point, like, well, Chris, why is Sauron doing this? Like, he's playing with fire. 100%. You're right. Good question. But he's also very hubris. There's a lot of hubris, right? You've got to remember, Sauron is about as atheist as you can get if you've met God personally. He fully believes that Eru has just completely fucking abandoned everyone. He thinks Eru is in no way going to give up. And I've said it in one of the previous episodes about Sauron. Sauron believes that the Valar really do not give a shit about Middle-earth anymore. That the only way they would send anyone back is if they were going to start to colonize them. Like, otherwise, they're not really that bothered. And that's how he views the Astari. Other than that, he doesn't think they're really going to directly intervene for a long time. So he feels pretty confident that he can just say whatever the fuck he wants. And he can maybe convince Númenor to attack them, and they'll only destroy them out of, like, retaliation. Like, so he thinks he'll be fine. He can just do whatever the hell he wants. Because remember, he left. He didn't go back at the end of the first age like he was told to. He didn't go back to Aman. He didn't go back to the Valar to face judgment. He just fucked off into Middle-earth. And as far as, from his point of view, nobody chased him. Nobody hunted him down. Nobody gives a fuck. So he's just convinced himself, right, nobody cares, I can do what I want. And that's quite a very powerful thought. I use that a lot when I'm in situations where I might need confidence or I'm worried about what people think. Well, spoiler alert, I rarely ever care about what people think. But I do always just have this underlying thought in my head. I was like, nobody really cares. Everybody thinks about themselves. They don't give a fuck about you. You're fine. So the next time you're in public and you think you're acting weird, just remember, nobody gives a shit. I was walking through London one day after a hackathon at work, and I saw a guy at the traffic lights with just his boxer shorts on and some very expensive shoes. And 2 minutes after it happened, I could not remember the colour of that guy's hair or what he looked like. So, the moral of the story is if you want to walk around in your underwear in public, just do it. So nobody cares. That's what Sauron did. He walked around in Númenor in his underwear and nobody cared because he thought the gods have abandoned us. Anyway, where was I? Right, okay, right. So, got distracted there. So Sauron uses all of his subtlety and his corruption on the Númenor, his subtlety at corruption on the Númenóreans. And it's probably, I'm going to give you another fantastic quote about just how the psychology of how he did this. To wean one of the God-fearing from their allegiance, it is best to propound another unseen object of allegiance and another hope of benefits. Propound to him a lord who will sanction what he desires and not forbid it. Sauron, apparently a defeated rival for world power, now a mere hostage, can hardly propound himself. But as the former servant and disciple of Melkor, the worship of Melkor will raise him from a hostage to high priest, and Melkor is Morgoth. So, to put it simply, he knew to corrupt them, you need to cut them off from the Valar completely. And to do that, just tell them that Morgoth will give them whatever the fuck they want. And it's as simple as that. And he does that. And it's the same with sales as well. Do you know, like, if you're ever in a sales situation where someone might say, a very common sales tactic is, I can't do that, let me go and ask my manager. This manager is probably never consulted, but it is this mystical other that can be either the good person or the bad person, depending on what the situation needs. So it's very common for the salespeople to go away and then come back and say, "Oh, I've spoken to my manager. Wow, aren't you lucky? We can do this." Or like, "Oh, I'm really sorry to say, if we don't close the deal by the end of the week, it's gone." Right? I've had that used on me multiple times throughout my life. And that's exactly what this is. Someone's just saying, "Hey, the Valar can't do that, but my boss can." And it's this mystical other is a way, and it's, it works. So Númenor really accelerates their decline with all this shit. And they eventually get to the point where there's huge temples built to Morgoth, which I'm going to describe in a second because I pulled out all the literature for this episode. And the quote about Ar-Pharazôn, he starts to worship Morgoth. And it says, Ar-Pharazôn the king turned back to the worship of the dark and of Melkor, Morgoth, the lord thereof, at first in secret, but ere long openly and in the face of his people, and they for the most part followed him. And one of the biggest religious acts that Sauron has the king perform is to burn the White Tree of Númenor, which you'll know from the films, the White Tree of Gondor, right? So this tree was a gift from the elves to the Númenorians. And Isildur, and he's part of the faithful. So Isildur's alive at this time when this is happening. He manages to rescue a cutting of the tree that he takes with him to Middle-earth, and it continues living and blossoms and eventually ends up in Minas Tirith, which is where you'd have seen it. The original tree, though, is burned when the temple to Morgoth is built. And this is one of the most fucking metal quotes. Sauron caused to be built on the hill in the midst of the city of the Númenorians, Ar-Menelaos the Golden, a mighty temple. And it was in the form of a circle at the base, and there the walls were 50 feet in thickness, and the width of the base was 500 feet across the centre, and the walls rose from the ground 500 feet, and they were crowned with a mighty dome. And that dome was roofed all with silver, and rose glittering in the sun, so that the light could be seen far off. But soon the light was darkened, and the silver became black, for there was an altar of fire in the midst of the temple, and in the topmost of the dome there was a louver, whence there issued a great smoke. And the first fire upon the altar Sauron kindled with the hewn wood of Nimloth, and it cracked and was consumed. But men marvelled at the reek that went up from it, so that the land lay under a cloud for 7 days, until slowly it passed into the west. So I want to impress on you that this now is fucking wild. This is shit getting crazy. Like, this is literally end of days type scenario, right? And I want you to remember that. It's like the Purge, it's breakdown in public order, because another quote, and again, we're very quote heavy this week, but it needs to be because it's just so awesome. But for all this, death did not depart from the land. Rather, it came sooner and more often, and in many dreadful guises. For whereas aforetime men had grown slowly old, and had laid them down in the end to sleep when they were weary at last with the world, now madness and sickness assailed them. And yet they were afraid to die and go out into the dark and the realm of the Lord that they had taken. And they cursed themselves in their agony. And men took weapons in those days and slew one another for little cause, for they were become quick to anger. And Sauron, or those whom he had bound to himself, went about the land setting man against man, so that people murmured against the king and the lords, or against any that had aught they had not, and the men of power took cruel revenge. So even though they were afraid of the dark and death, they were still getting sick and they were still dying, and they were living shorter lives because of this corruption. So everything they wanted had been turned against them. They didn't get any of it and destroyed themselves, and Sauron was a catalyst for it. And this is the part where Sheev Palpatine would say it was ironic. But still, even though it was crazy, their power was still increasing as a nation. They were able to build better ships and better engines, because Sauron, as a student of Outlay, was always good at building stuff. So they actively now, they began to enslave people in Middle-earth, and they would take their shit and they would sacrifice people. Like, the Númenóreans are full-blown evil now. Ar-Pharazôn became the greatest tyrant the world had ever seen since Morgoth himself. That's the equivalent of insert your least favourite world leader here being on par with Satan. That's exactly the situation. And so, these 50 years passed, right? This is all during this 50 years. And at the end of it, Ar-Pharazôn starts to feel death approaching. And that, my friends, that was the precursor. That was the warm-up. Because Ar-Pharazôn feels death coming, and he's scared. And Sauron takes all of his prep time, and he does his master stroke. He uses this fear of death to convince Ar-Pharazôn to build what is called the Great Armament. This starts in the year 3310 of the Second Age, and in the year 3319 it is finished, and in the year 3319 he attacks Valinor, and that is when Númenor falls. That is the apocalypse. So in the year 3310, Sauron smooth talks the king. He says he can claim immortality. And this is what Sauron says to the king who feels death coming. And he said, "The gift of life unending is not for all, but only for such as are worthy, being men of might and pride and great lineage. Yet against all justice is it done that this gift, which is his due, should be withheld from the King of Kings, Ar-Pharazôn, mightiest of the sons of earth, to whom Manwë alone can be compared, if even he. But great kings do not brook denials, and take what is their due." He says to this king, "You are the greatest king to have ever lived, and even Manwë can't compare to you, king of the small g gods. Go get it, girl. Go get it. Get it. Get that dick. Take that money." That's what the fuck he says. And Ar-Pharazôn starts to build, and over 9 years, he does. The weather itself over these 9 years, it turns against them. And this is where it gets a bit weird, because I always thought the Valar were not able to harm the children of Eru. But the weather itself turns. There are great clouds that appear, shaped like an eagle, that come from the west, and the lightning storms would come. And these great storms would wreck ships, and Númenóreans would shake their fists and shout at the sky, "The lords of the west have plotted against us. They strike first. The next blow shall be ours." These words the king himself spoke, but they were devised by Sauron. Now the lightnings increased and slew men upon the hills, and in the fields, and in the streets of the city. And a fiery bolt smote the dome of the temple, and shore it asunder, and it was wreathed in flame. But the temple itself was unshaken, and Sauron stood there upon the pinnacle, and defied the lightning, and was unharmed. And in that hour men called him a god, and did all that he would. When therefore the last portent came, they heeded it little, the last warning from the Valar. For the land shook under them, and the groaning as of thunder underground was mingled with the roaring of the sea, and smoke issued from the peak of Men Eltama. But all the more did Ar-Pharazôn press on with his armament. They warned the Númenóreans, the Valar warned them as much as... They even killed some of them, which to me seems crazy. I didn't think they were allowed to do that. But apparently there's exceptions. And the armament continues. And it 9 years to build the greatest force that I think maybe had ever been seen by humans. Ever. And eventually it's built. And I'll read some more for you. "And men brought him victims to be burned. Then the eagles of the lords of the west came up out of the dayfall, and they were arrayed as for battle, advancing in a line, the end of which diminished beyond sight. And as they came, their wings spread ever wider, grasping the sky. But the west burned red behind them, and they glowed underneath, as though they were lit with a flame of great anger, so that all of Númenor was illumined as with a smouldering fire. And men looked upon the face of their fellows, and it seemed to them that they were red with wrath." This is it. I know We talk about Lord of the Rings, and we talk about it there being apocalypse after apocalypse after apocalypse. But this is the most human one. And this is the tipping point where, and there's still a chance to end this fucking madness. But our Pharazôn boards his ship called Alcarondas, which means the Castle of the Sea, and there's a big throne on it, and our Pharazôn sits on it. It's a golden throne. And so they went, and they set sail for Aman and Valinor. And it was silent. There was no wind, there was no nothing. But the Númenóreans have slaves, and they whip them. And they whip their slaves, and they row. And they row, and they row. And this is where they get there. They get to Valinor. They get to the shores. And they're on their ships. And our Pharazôn, this is his defining moment. Everything that came before was awful. But here he wavers. He very, very nearly does the right thing. He almost turned back. But pride cometh before a fall. And he steps foot onto the shores of Aman. Not Tol Eressëa, actual Aman, the continent where the Valar live. And he claims the land for himself. I imagine he probably shouts it like Michael Scott declaring bankruptcy. But he claims the land for his own, saying that if no one will fight me for it, then this is mine. And his forces, they all advance to the hill of Tuna, which is where all of the elves have fled to. It's entirely silent. Nobody wants to fight them. That's not ever been the point of the children of Ilúvatar. They've never wanted to fight. The Valar have never ever wanted to do it. And it gets so desperate that they don't want to hurt them, allegedly, even though the fucking lightning kills them, whatever. But the Valar don't know what to do. This is completely beyond anything that they've had to deal with. And Manwë has been very busy while this is happening. He has stood on the mountain Tanaquetil, the tallest mountain in the world, and he asks God for advice. He asks his Eru Ilúvatar. And what happens is the Valar say, we can't do this. This is not something we can act in. And they, for the moment, the Valar give up. But what they give up is they give up their right to govern the world. They lay down the mantle of power that Eru was given to them. And they stop being like, they say, we're not doing this anymore. We can't do it. We're not going to hurt. We're not going to destroy Eru's creations. That's what our father made. If this is his plan, then so be it. We can't do this anymore. We can't govern the world. And they lay down. And God steps in personally. This is when Eru Ilúvatar steps into the world and does perhaps the greatest intervention. The other one really, I suppose, being Gollum slipping into the lava. But this one's a little bit more dramatic because what happens is a few things happen. God, or Eru, first, he changes the world completely. First, he opens a great chasm in the ocean between Númenor and Aman. A massive, massive chasm that just swallows, destroys, drowns the entire force of Númenor's navy. The entire great armament is dragged underneath the ocean. But the forces that were on land still are Pharazôn. The hills bury them. They are buried beneath the hills. And this is, depending on your point of view, this can be a little bit sick actually, but they get their wish for immortal life because they are trapped in somewhere called the Caves of the Forgotten, deep underground. And it's said that they will be trapped there to wait forever until Dagor Dagorath, which is Tolkien's Ragnarok. So our Pharazôn in the end did get immortality, which again, I wish I had Sheev. I wish I had a soundboard for Palpatine, just ironic. But the world was changed in other ways, and when, Eru steps in, he steps in big time. The lands of Aman and Tol Eressëa are removed completely from the world. No mortal will ever be able to get there again, unless specifically allowed. And what he does is he makes the earth round, so that new seas are formed, but that you'll never see the edge of the ocean, that if you go out west, you'll eventually come back east. And elves and Maiar and what have you are the only ones who can properly access Tol Eressëa and Aman now by something called the Straight Road. And that's why the world is round, is because of this, the fall of Númenor. And Númenor itself, it's not God's not done yet. So Sauron's waiting at Númenor. He's laughing his ass off. Literally, he's fucking loving life. But Númenor is utterly destroyed. There's the mountain Meneltarma. The queen tries to climb it right at the end, but she wasn't successful. And the Númenor's downfall is described as, and the sky reeled and the hills slid. And Númenor went down into the sea with all of its children and wives and maidens and its ladies proud, and all its gardens and its halls and its towers, its tombs and its riches, and its jewels and its webs, and its things painted and carven, and its laughter and its mirth and its music, its wisdom and its law. They vanished forever. At last, of all the mounting wave, green and cold and plumed with foam, climbing over the land, took to its bosom Tar Miriel, the queen, fairer than silver or ivory or pearls. Too late she strove to ascend the steep ways of Meneltarma to the holy place, for the waters overtook her, and her cry was lost in the roaring of the wind. Everyone on Númenor, everyone who was on Númenor at the time died. Every single one of them. Not just the men, but the women and the children too. And it was only some of the faithful were able to escape to Middle-earth, and they were deposited on the shores by the same waves that destroyed Númenor, by the changing of the world. And that's where, obviously, that was like Elendil and Anarion and Isildur, where they formed the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor, and that's other things. But where was Sauron in all of this, in this great apocalypse? Well, he was sat in the temple in Armenelos, laughing his fucking ass off. He was laughing at everything, but like I mentioned earlier, he underestimated Eru and the Valar, and he certainly did not expect that to happen in that way. He thought maybe, all right, they might kill Pharazôn, might destroy the armament, and then I can do the rest. But I'll also point out that what happens here is so devastating to Sauron himself that he loses the ability to take on a fair form after this. Like, he loses the ability to make himself a twink. And a description of his last moments in Númenor, for the death of the Númenorians and the defeat of their proud king. And Sauron, sitting in his black seat in the midst of the temple, had laughed when he heard the trumpets of Ar-Pharazôn sounding for battle. And again, he had laughed when he heard the thunder of the storm. And a third time, even as he laughed at his own thought, thinking what he would do now in the world, being rid of the Edain forever, he was taken in the midst of his mirth, and his seat and his temple fell into the abyss. But Sauron was not of mortal flesh, and though he was robbed now of that shape in which he had wrought so great an evil, so he could never again appear fair to the eyes of men, yet his spirit arose out of the deep, and passed as a shadow and a black wind over the sea, and came back to Middle-earth, and to Mordor that was his home. There he took up again his great ring in Barad-dûr, and dwelt there, dark and silent, until he wrought himself a new guise, an image of malice and hatred made visible, and the eye of Sauron, the terrible, few could endure. And so, that's where Sauron found himself back in Mordor, with his ring, with his reconstituted body, and he'd stay there for a while. At least. He'd stay there for roughly 109 years, really. And that's when he moves and starts shit with the Kingdom of Gondor, which was founded the year after Númenor fell by the survivors. So, like I said, Isildur, Elendil, and Anarion were three of the survivors, and they start their kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor. But that is a story for another time, and it is probably the story for next time, actually, where we will cover what Sauron does in that time that leads up to the War of the Last Alliance. Goodness me, I think another apocalypse in which Sauron plays a part is enough for today. That was a really, really intense story. I absolutely loved it. I really enjoyed researching it. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. It's proper heavy, but I mean, it might just be the biggest event we've covered on this on the show so far. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. It's a hell of a lot more second age stuff than I'd originally intended, but he's so deeply tied in to what happens that you've got to include it. So yeah, next time we're going to look at the events leading up to and the Battle of the Last Alliance, where Sauron meets another supposed end, but this will be for 3,000 years or so, I think, give or take, until he starts to reform and pop up again in the Third Age in Dol Guldur and stuff like that, before we'll move on to the War of the Ring and the possible Fourth Age connection, where people try and resurrect him, but that won't be much. But yes, I think we are coming... Well, we're definitely in the latter half of the Sauron series. I've had a hell of a lot of fun. I hope you have as well. Please come and talk to me on Instagram. Come and hang out in the Discord. We're a jolly bunch. We're just having a good old chat. Yeah, that's about it. I hope you're having a fantastic day wherever you are. I hope you continue to be safe, make good choices. Remember, don't spend too much time online. Go for a walk. Things that people scream about on the internet, generally not massively important in real life, you'll find. Just, yeah. Right. I'm going to scoot, because me and Becca have got a date night, so I'm going to get this episode edited and out to you, and I will speak to you soon. Bye!